The engines hummed as Flight 447 prepared for takeoff. But inside the cabin, time seemed to move differently for the man in seat 17B. He wrestled quietly with his seatbelt, his hands trembling with age, not frustration. Then something slipped, a faint metallic clink barely heard over the boarding chatter. A small object bounced once off the armrest and rolled out of sight beneath the seat ahead. He didn't look down. His eyes were locked forward, lost in a place far beyond the plane. Whatever had fallen wasn't as heavy as the weight he already carried. The air hostess, brisk and professional, caught a faint glint near his feet. She crouched down with the kind of routine grace that comes from countless flights, expecting a coin or a forgotten pair of spectacles. But what she found made her inhale sharply. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the bronze star with its delicate blue ribbon, the metal cool in her palm, the engraved name etched into eternity. She turned to the man, her mouth slightly open as if trying to speak, but nothing came. Up in the cockpit, the co-pilot was going over final checklists when she knocked gently on the door, holding out the medal and shaking hands. The pilot turned, just a glance, and froze. Silence fell. His eyes locked on the name. The color drained from his face. And then, tears. Not from pain, not from sadness, but from memory. That name belonged to the man who had once dragged him from the wreckage of a burning Humvee. The man who had disappeared after the medevac. The man everyone assumed had died. The pilot stood up without a word and stepped into the cabin. As passengers murmured in confusion, the old man in 17B slowly turned his head. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the decades melted away, and all that remained was a single thread of brotherhood that had somehow, against all odds, survived the fire. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and your support means everything to us. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Denver International Airport. Flight 447 to Phoenix was running slightly behind schedule, nothing unusual for the busy travel season. Gate C-23 buzzed with the familiar sounds of rolling luggage, crying babies, and passengers checking their phones while waiting to board. Among the crowd sat Harold Mitchell, 89 years old, wearing a simple brown cardigan over a white-collared shirt. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture straight despite his age. He carried only a small canvas bag, the kind that suggested a man who had learned to travel light and expect little. Nobody paid him any attention. To the other passengers, he was just another elderly traveler, perhaps visiting grandchildren or heading somewhere warm for his health. The gate agent called his boarding group without fanfare. He stood slowly, gathered his bag, and joined the line. No special assistance, no priority boarding, no recognition of any kind. He handed his ticket to the scanner, walked down the jetway, and found his assigned seat in coach, row 17, seat B. The middle seat that nobody wants. The plane filled around him with the usual mix of business travelers typing on laptops, families juggling snacks and entertainment for restless children, and tourists discussing their vacation plans. Harold settled into his seat quietly, declining the flight attendant's offer of a pillow or blanket. He had learned long ago to be self-sufficient, to need very little, to occupy as small a space as possible in a world that had largely forgotten he existed. Sarah Chun had been working as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines for 7 years. She prided herself on reading people, on anticipating what passengers needed before they asked. The businessman in 12, it would want his coffee black and his newspaper folded just so. The mother in 8C would need extra napkins and patience when her toddler inevitably spilled something. But the old man in 17B puzzled her. He seemed almost invisible, sitting perfectly still with his hands folded in his lap, looking out the window at nothing in particular. During the safety demonstration, she noticed he wasn't watching the presentation like most passengers. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the small airplane window, somewhere far away. When she asked if he needed help with his seatbelt, he simply shook his head politely and continued fumbling with the metal clasp. His fingers, she noticed, were gnarled and stiff, marked by old scars that suggested a lifetime of hard work or perhaps something more difficult to categorize. As the engines began their final preparation for takeoff, Harold reached into his jacket pocket, perhaps looking for tissues or medication. That's when it happened. The small object that would change everything slipped from his fingers, struck the armrest, and disappeared beneath the seat in front of him. He made no effort to retrieve it. He didn't call for help or seem particularly concerned. He just sat back in his seat and closed his eyes, as if losing things was something he had grown accustomed to over the years. Sarah was making her final walkthrough before takeoff when she spotted the metallic glint near his feet. Customer service training kicked in automatically. She knelt down beside his seat, reaching under the tray table to retrieve what she assumed was a dropped coin or piece of jewelry. Her fingers closed around something small and surprisingly heavy. As she brought it up to eye level, the overhead reading light caught the surface of the object, and Sarah's world stopped moving. The bronze star seemed to glow under the cabin lights, suspended from a ribbon of pale blue silk that had faded with age but still carried an unmistakable dignity. The inscription around the star's edges was clear despite decades of handling. United States of America. But it was the words engraved on the reverse side that made Sarah's hands begin to tremble. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. She had seen enough movies and documentaries to recognize what she was holding. This wasn't a participation trophy or a service ribbon. This was the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration that the United States could bestow. It was given only to those who had performed acts of valor so extraordinary that they defied comprehension. Sarah's grandfather had been a veteran, and she remembered him speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the men who had earned this particular honor. Most of them, he had told her, never lived to wear it. The plane was taxiing now, picking up speed as it moved toward the runway. Sarah knew she should return to her jump seat for takeoff, but she couldn't move. She stared at the medal in her palm, then at the old man who had dropped it. Harold hadn't opened his eyes or acknowledged her presence. He sat perfectly still, breathing slowly and evenly, as if he were preparing himself for something much more challenging than a 2-hour flight to Phoenix. The weight of the medal seemed disproportionate to its size. Sarah understood that she wasn't just holding a piece of bronze and ribbon. She was holding a piece of history, a tangible connection to an act of heroism that had been deemed worthy of the nation's highest honor. But the man who had earned it was sitting in a middle seat in coach, traveling alone, apparently forgotten by a world that owed him more than it could ever repay. Captain James Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for Delta Airlines for 15 years. Before that, he had served as a pilot in the Air Force, flying transport missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. He understood military culture, respected military service, and made it a point to acknowledge veterans when he encountered them during flights. But he had never encountered anything like what Sarah Chun was about to show him. Sarah pressed the call button that connected her headset directly to the cockpit. Her voice was shaky, uncertain of how to communicate what she had discovered. Captain Rodriguez could hear the tension in her voice immediately. Flight attendants, in his experience, were trained to remain calm under pressure. If Sarah was rattled, something significant was happening in the cabin. She explained the situation quickly, quietly, aware that passengers were beginning to notice her prolonged presence near row 17. The old man had dropped something. She had picked it up. It was the Congressional Medal of Honor. Captain Rodriguez asked her to repeat herself, certain he had misheard. Sarah confirmed what she had said, adding that the inscription indicated the medal had been awarded for actions that had saved multiple lives under extreme combat conditions. The captain made a decision that went against standard protocol. He engaged the autopilot, left his co-pilot in command, and walked back into the cabin. Flight regulations discouraged captains from leaving the cockpit during flight except in emergencies, but Captain Rodriguez understood that some situations transcended normal procedures. He needed to see this for himself. Sarah met him near the galley, her hands still trembling as she held the medal. Captain Rodriguez took one look at it and felt his own composure begin to crumble. He had read about these medals, had studied military history extensively during his service years. He knew that fewer than 3,500 medals of honor had been awarded since the decoration was created during the Civil War. He knew that many recipients had died earning them. And he knew that the living recipients were considered nothing short of American royalty in military circles. The inscription on Harold's medal was more specific than most. Along with the standard language about gallantry and intrepidity, it included a date and location: Vietnam, March 15, 1971. Captain Rodriguez's knowledge of military history allowed him to place that date in context. March 1971 was during the final, desperate phase of American involvement in Vietnam, when small units were often isolated and surrounded, fighting against overwhelming odds with little hope of reinforcement or rescue. He looked across the cabin at the old man in seat 17B, who was now awake and staring out the window at the landscape passing below. Harold appeared completely unaware of the drama unfolding around his dropped medal. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, perhaps remembering things that had happened 50 years ago in a jungle on the other side of the world. Captain Rodriguez handed the medal back to Sarah and walked slowly toward row 17. He had decided that this situation required more than simply returning a dropped object. This required acknowledgement, recognition, and respect for something that had been overlooked for far too long. As he approached Harold's seat, the captain found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. Harold sensed someone standing beside his seat and turned to look up. His eyes met Captain Rodriguez's, and for a moment, neither man spoke. The captain was wearing his uniform with the 4 stripes that indicated his rank and experience. Harold's gaze lingered on those stripes, recognizing authority and responsibility when he saw it. Captain Rodriguez spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the aircraft engines. He explained that the flight attendant had found something that Harold had dropped. He asked if Harold would like it returned. Harold nodded slowly, extending his hand to receive whatever it was he had lost. When the medal was placed in his palm, his fingers closed around it immediately, instinctively, like a man protecting something precious. The captain remained standing beside the seat, studying Harold's face. He could see the depth of experience written in the lines around the old man's eyes, the quiet strength that comes from surviving things that would break lesser men. But he could also see something else, a profound weariness, a sense of being forgotten by the world he had once fought to protect. What happened next would be talked about by everyone on that plane for the rest of their lives. Captain Rodriguez, a professional aviator with thousands of flight hours and an impeccable safety record, began to cry. Not the subtle tearing that might be dismissed as allergies or fatigue, but genuine, overwhelming emotion that he couldn't control or conceal. He was crying for Harold, certainly, but also for something larger. He was crying for all the veterans who had come home from wars to find that their sacrifices had been forgotten or misunderstood. He was crying for the disconnect between the honors bestowed in formal ceremonies and the reality of aging heroes riding in middle seats, invisible and unacknowledged. He was crying for the weight of gratitude that he had never properly expressed to the men and women who had made his own life possible. Other passengers began to notice the scene unfolding in row 17. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. The businessman in 12A looked up from his laptop. The mother in 8C paused her attempt to entertain her restless child. Something was happening that demanded attention, even if they didn't yet understand what it was. Harold looked up at the crying pilot with confusion and perhaps a touch of concern. He wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, and he certainly wasn't comfortable with displays of emotion directed toward him. He had spent decades deflecting praise, minimizing his own actions, and redirecting conversations away from his military service. The idea that his mere presence could move someone to tears was both bewildering and deeply uncomfortable. Captain Rodriguez composed himself enough to speak, though his voice remained thick with emotion. He asked Harold if he would be willing to share his story, to help the other passengers understand what they were in the presence of. Harold shook his head politely but firmly. He had never been one for speeches or public recognition. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. He didn't need applause or acknowledgement. But Captain Rodriguez understood that this moment was bigger than Harold's personal preferences. This was an opportunity to educate, to honor, and to remind people of the debt they owed to those who had served. He made a decision that would transform an ordinary flight into something extraordinary. He returned to the cockpit, took the intercom microphone, and asked for the attention of everyone aboard Flight 447. His voice carried throughout the cabin with an authority and solemnity that immediately commanded respect. Passengers stopped their conversations, put down their books and magazines, and turned their attention to the captain's words. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is Captain Rodriguez. I need to share something with you that I believe will change how you think about this flight and perhaps how you think about the people around you every day. A few minutes ago, our flight attendant Sarah discovered that one of our passengers had dropped something. That something was the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, awarded for acts of valor so extraordinary that they defy comprehension. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the crying baby in row 8 seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. The gentleman in seat 17B, Mr. Harold Mitchell, earned that medal 53 years ago in Vietnam. According to the citation, he single-handedly held off an enemy assault for 6 hours, saving the lives of 47 American soldiers who would otherwise have died that day. He was wounded 3 times during the action but refused medical evacuation until every other member of his unit had been safely extracted. Passengers began turning in their seats, trying to get a glimpse of the man the captain was describing. Harold sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his hands folded in his lap with the medal clutched between his fingers. He appeared to be trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. Captain Rodriguez wasn't finished. Mr. Mitchell never talked about what he did that day. He came home, raised a family, worked as a mechanic for 40 years, and lived quietly in the same small town where he was born. He didn't write books about his experiences or give speeches at military ceremonies. He just lived his life, carrying the weight of that day and the memory of the men he saved, asking for nothing in return. The captain paused, gathering himself for what he needed to say next. Today, Mr. Mitchell was traveling to Phoenix to attend the funeral of one of those 47 men he saved. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, Sarah's grandfather, passed away last week at the age of 94. He lived a full life, saw his children and grandchildren grow up, and died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. All of that was possible because of what Mr. Mitchell did on March 15, 1971. Sarah gasped audibly from her position near the galley. The connection she hadn't understood suddenly became clear. Her grandfather had talked about that day in Vietnam, about the young soldier who had saved his life and the lives of his entire unit. She had grown up hearing stories about a hero whose name her grandfather had never forgotten, whose actions had made her own existence possible. The captain's voice filled the cabin one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the presence of a living legend. Not because he wears a uniform or carries a title, but because he demonstrated the highest form of human courage when it mattered most. I'm going to ask you to do something that's not normally part of air travel. I'm going to ask you to stand and show this American hero the respect he has never asked for, but absolutely deserves. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most moving experiences of their lives. Passengers began standing, one by one, until every person in the cabin was on their feet. The applause started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but it grew into something thunderous and sustained. People were crying openly, not just for Harold, but for the recognition of something pure and selfless in a world that often seemed to have forgotten such qualities existed. Harold finally opened his eyes and looked around the cabin. For a moment, he seemed overwhelmed by the attention, uncertain how to respond to such an outpouring of gratitude and respect. Then, slowly, he stood as well, not to acknowledge the applause, but simply to show respect for the people who were showing respect for him. The applause continued for several minutes, accompanied by cheers and expressions of gratitude that came from deep places in people's hearts. The businessman in 12A was crying as hard as anyone. The mother in 8C held her child close and whispered something about heroes and the importance of remembering them. Even the flight crew, trained to maintain professional composure at all times, were openly emotional. When the applause finally died down and passengers began to return to their seats, something fundamental had changed in the cabin. People looked at each other differently, spoke more quietly and respectfully, and seemed to understand that they had been part of something significant. Harold sat back down in his middle seat, but he was no longer invisible. He was surrounded by people who finally understood who he was and what he represented. For the remainder of the flight, passengers approached Harold's seat to shake his hand, to say thank you, and to share their own stories of military family members or their gratitude for his service. Harold accepted each interaction with grace and humility, though it was clear that such attention remained uncomfortable for him. He had spent more than 50 years deflecting praise and avoiding recognition. Learning to accept gratitude was not a skill he had ever needed to develop. Saracen spent much of the flight near row 17, not because it was her assigned area, but because she needed to be close to the connection she had discovered. This quiet man had saved her grandfather's life, which meant he had made her own life possible. The debt she owed him was literally immeasurable, and she struggled to find words adequate to express what she was feeling. Captain Rodriguez made 2 more announcements during the flight. The first was to inform passengers that the airline would be upgrading Mr. Mitchell to first class for all future flights, a small gesture that seemed appropriate given the circumstances. The second was to read a brief history of the Medal of Honor and to explain why Harold's actions in Vietnam represented the highest traditions of American military service. As Flight 447 began its descent into Phoenix, Harold looked out the window at the desert landscape below and thought about Robert Chun, the young soldier he had known briefly more than 50 years ago. Robert had made it home from that jungle, had lived to see his children grow up, had experienced decades of life that might have been cut short on that March day in 1971. Harold had carried the weight of that day for most of his adult life, but he had also carried the satisfaction of knowing that his actions had mattered, that 47 families had been spared the grief of loss because he had done what needed to be done. The landing was smooth and routine, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged with emotion and respect. As passengers began to disembark, many stopped to shake Harold's hand one final time or to offer words of gratitude. The businessman from 12A pressed his business card into Harold's hand and told him to call if he ever needed anything. The mother from 8C introduced her son to Harold and explained that he was meeting a real American hero. Harold gathered his small canvas bag and walked slowly up the aisle toward the exit. At the door of the aircraft, Captain Rodriguez was waiting for him. The 2 men shook hands, and the captain thanked Harold not just for his service, but for the reminder of what true heroism looked like. Harold nodded, stepped off the plane, and disappeared into the crowd at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. But the story didn't end there. Sarah Chun returned to her grandfather's funeral with a deeper understanding of the debt her family owed to a man named Harold Mitchell. She shared the story of the flight with everyone present, helping them understand the connection between the quiet hero her grandfather had described for decades and the humble man who had traveled across the country to pay his respects. The other passengers carried the story with them as well, sharing it with family and friends, posting about it on social media, and using it as an example of the hidden heroes who walk among us every day. The businessman from 12A donated money to veterans organizations in Harold's name. The mother from 8C used the experience to teach her children about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of recognizing those who serve. Captain Rodriguez requested Harold's contact information from the airline and began a correspondence that would continue for the rest of Harold's life. He learned more about that day in Vietnam, about the decades of quiet service that followed, and about the profound humility that had kept Harold's heroism hidden for so long. Harold Mitchell returned to his small town, his medal safely tucked away in the same jacket pocket where it had rested for years. He attended Robert Chen's funeral, said goodbye to a brother he had saved long ago, and returned to his quiet life. But something had changed during that flight. For the first time in decades, Harold felt seen, understood, and properly honored for the sacrifice he had made. The medal never left his pocket again, but its weight felt different now. It was no longer just a reminder of a terrible day in a distant jungle. It had become a symbol of connection, recognition, and the enduring power of gratitude expressed at exactly the right moment. Sometimes heroes hide in plain sight, wearing ordinary clothes and carrying extraordinary memories in silence. They sit in middle seats on commercial flights, declining special treatment and avoiding attention, believing that their time for recognition has passed or that their actions don't warrant public acknowledgement. But they're wrong. The world needs to remember what they did, needs to understand the debt we owe them, and needs to ensure that their sacrifices are never forgotten or taken for granted. Harold Mitchell didn't ask for recognition on Flight 447. He didn't want attention or applause or special treatment. He just wanted to attend a funeral and honor a fallen comrade. But sometimes the universe has other plans. Sometimes a dropped medal becomes a bridge between past heroism and present gratitude. Sometimes a flight attendant's curiosity becomes the catalyst for recognition that is decades overdue. And sometimes, when we least expect it, We find ourselves in the presence of living legends who remind us what courage, sacrifice, and quiet dignity actually look like. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe it was a teacher who changed your life, a parent who sacrificed everything, or a neighbor who helped when no one else would. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their quiet heroism shaped who you are today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.